Welcome, everyone. We're going to start the special study session for November 7th, 2017.
November 13th, would you say?
November 7th?
13th.
Today's the 13th.
Why does it say 7th? And
That's a good question.
That had the wrong date on it.
okay, well then we're going to do this for the 13th. Thank you. That's really funny. Okay, well.
We start over again.
Yeah, we're starting over. Oh, and also I've already been here for an hour.
You started.
Because it started at
I
5:30.
see. I thought it started
Exactly.
at 5:32. Thank goodness. But
Thank you.
Melanie sent out an email.
Okay, well, welcome, everyone. I know the first thing on our agenda tonight is public comment. And so do we have a sign-up list? Great.
I was coming. Doesn't it feel colder to you than usual in this
Yeah.
room?
On there, if we don't have Tom here today.
Yeah.
Good question.
Serious, huh?
No.
Okay, so the very first person on our list tonight is Karen Herring. Karen, would you like to come up to the podium? Let me explain how it works. You have 3 minutes for public comment. I think there's a light on there that shows you 3 minutes. And so if you could first give your name and address for the record, and then, as you know, you'll have your 3 minutes, and this is the public comment is videotaped and streamed on Channel 21. Great, thank you, Karen. Welcome. Well, did we hold on one second, Karen?
And can you
Go ahead. Maybe we can start her over again and move the microphone down.
sorry.
Let's get that PowerPoint up if you submitted it.
What's happening? I'm just checking this. Just get a little bit closer.
Great.
It really look right up.
That one?
Ah,
Perfect.
ready?
Yep, I've got it right here.
So rain season is here. I learned that 3 kokanee and 2 reds were spotted in Laughing Jacobs. Sorry, I get emotional.
It's okay.
This is good news, and we need to make sure it's not the last time we hear it. Stormwater runoff is a fact in our city. All runoff ends in our streams, creeks, and lakes, and it affects all areas. Critical areas have buffers, wetlands have rules, landslide hazards have rules, erosion areas have rules. Please don't allow lessened code that does not protect these areas. Please require new development to be responsible for stormwater management, including proper drainage, collection, and monitoring, so all of us who live downhill can hold the developers responsible for any of those runoff issues. And the PowerPoint shows a development at, I don't know how that works. This is at Southeast 32nd coming east from a Buchanan development that's almost at 244th. And where no other water is running, this is draining today. Now, I know we had a lot of water last night and this morning, but no other drain in my neighborhood is doing this. This is just down more, heading more west towards 241st. This is another drain on the, that might be on the other side of the development, but either way, this is on Southeast 30th going west. As you can see, that ditch is dry. Now, if you stepped in it, it's going to be mushy, but it is not running. This is the one on the other side of the Buchanan development at 243rd-ish. The one you saw before was on 32nd. This is 30th. It's coming towards 244th. It is also running. And finally, this slide is on 32nd, heading west, east. I'm mixed up. But this shows a drainage system that is not full of water. It's also mushy, but it doesn't collect as much water because it has all of the nature there. It has blackberries, a lot of pine in the neighborhood next to it, and it's fully developed. So just please consider these when you're doing your storm drainage codes to protect, maybe add some nature and evergreens and such. Thank you.
Very good, Karen. Thank you so much for your comment. Next, we have Mary Wichter. I did notice your printing is different than your writing, Mary.
I tried to write neater this time. So my name's Mary Wichter, and I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish. So your stormwater code amendments are in front of you, and I have a lot of comment I can't fit in 3 minutes, but I will tell you that the thing that concerns me the most is the .040, where they're talking about allowing exemptions or exceptions from core or special requirements for drainage review, which I think is not a good thing. So there's a map in the packet which Tawny and the stormwater people produced. This is for critical drainage areas, and originally this was defined as Inglewood stormwater, and changes that Inglewood might want really are going to affect all these landslide hazard areas. So that's everything yellow and orange on the whole map. So over by Sahali, where there's nothing leading into a landslide hazard area, down by Snake Hill Road at 212th, there's a lot of development there that goes into a landslide hazard area. The top of every one of the salmon creeks, Pine Lake Creek, Ebright Creek, Zaccoose Creek, and George Davis, all have landslide hazard areas that do not have protections of erosion or other codes. So when you're doing these, if you make it more suitable for Inglewood, you're actually reducing the effectiveness for all the areas for the lakes and streams, and also above Tamarack where I live as well. So I think that's important to understand. This is actually from the King County Surface Water Design Manual. The one on the left is from the 2009. The one on the right is from 2016. And the very first column there that says small project drainage review, that got changed to just renamed to simplified drainage review, and then they added a category of directed, and then there's still the targeted, which has 3 categories. So basically on the right, those first 3 columns are for single family homes. So you can see between 2009 and 2016, instead of no check marks for the core requirements, they put them on all of them, and then most of them have a little footnote, so you can choose whether you apply them or not. The ones that are solid without that, I kind of highlighted sideways. So what's important here is it is important to do the core requirements and the special requirements for drainage review. Otherwise, what happens is you say, here's a drainage review, let's do it, or you're going to go around it, or you pull it out and you say, in the drainage review, there's so many square feet which exempts you from it, and then you don't end up with a drainage review at all. So if you really want to have drainage review, you actually have to look at the core requirements. And you can't just say, oh, you're a small house, there's a tiny amount of water coming off, we're just going to exempt you, because small house after small house after small house gets built, and when they're in the same subbasin, you end up with stormwater problems. So the things that you adopted in December, which became effective in January, is we were really trying to ensure that a drainage review would happen and is required for any landslide hazard area. And we did not allow any audit. So the current wording in the code says that you don't automatically allow any exemption or exception without the director of Public Works saying that it isn't needed. So you're going to actually see all the 9 requirements and all the special requirements done. Also, one of the reasons you had to adopt so much is because NPDES said you couldn't have cost exemptions for flow control, and you had to deal with all sites regardless of size. So these are the core requirements, and I really don't have enough time to speak on everything, but you really have to have discharge at the natural location. Off-site analysis means you look at what's happening below and above you. You have to have flow control facilities, number 3 or number 9. You need to do water quality. If you're building something, you need a conveyance system, and you need to maintain and operate it, and you need the financial guarantees.
I'm going to need you to wrap up, Mary.
So I want you to know that landslide and erosion don't fully overlap. The drainage review threshold at 500 square feet is good, but you shouldn't exempt. You should actually add, and this is not in the packet, key protections from the erosion hazard areas, because those are lacked in the landslide hazard areas, and they really need them. Removing from the 500 to 1,000 square feet can cause deleterious discharges, as you know, without a tight line. And if you keep things that they have to go through a reasonable use exception, that does provide noticing and allows public comment without automatically sending them through so that water goes downhill and hits the people who live below.
Thank you, Mary.
Mary, I didn't understand those first two tables. Could we go back to those again with all the checks now?
Yeah, so
The one
when
on the
you,
left, a check means it's, you can have it exempt?
no, so like in the very left column, where it's all blank and just the one check mark, that check mark just says this is the small project drainage review column, but there are no check marks under core requirement 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, and there only used to be 8. They added the BMPs, and then 1 through 5 through special. But in the right side, you'll see for the simplified drainage review, which is a small one that's just been renamed,
Right.
it says C Note 4, and it tells you what things might apply or not. And then it has check marks for actually all of them with little footnotes. And the same thing for the directed column, but on core requirement, I think it's number 7, that's a solid check, so you have to do that one. And then the problem with the targeted drainage review is they have the little footnotes, but they're asterisks, so you never go into them. And then if you go in and you read the code says, oh, if you're this small, you don't have to do it at all. So it's like saying, you got to have drainage review, but just kidding, TSA pre-check and go around. So the answer is with critical drainage areas, you need to do something, and it gives you the chance to have all the tools available, and then the director can choose which ones apply to your specific site, which I think gives you the control that you need and can make people have to mitigate their stormwater when they want to build, if you allow that.
Good, thank you. By the way, I am using the TSA pre-check tomorrow morning.
Cool. How would you feel if everybody under 5.5 didn't even have to walk through one of those things just because they're short? Might not be safe.
Thank you. Okay, is there anyone else that would like to speak this evening? That's it for public comment then, so thank you very much for those that did speak. I was going to ask the council to indulge us a little bit on the agenda.
Actually,
I'm not sure, did your communications consultant?
we're here, she's here.
Great. Then I don't need any indulgence. We're gonna do it.
Anne's here.
You know, that storm was holding people up.
We don't have to indulge you now?
Nope, not at all.
Saying Anne's here, so.
I'm on my own.
First. We're getting set up here. We're fortunate to have our consultant, Ann Fennessy, here this evening, along with our management analyst, Mike Sugg. So we'll have them set up in a moment, and Jesse Vaughn will introduce them going forward.
Welcome.
All right, it looks like we are ready to go. Thank you, Lyman, for the introduction, and good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Again, Jesse Bond, I'm the Deputy City Manager with the city. And tonight we are presenting on our findings from the communications strategic planning work that we've been doing the last couple of months. Joining me tonight is Ann Fennessy with Cocker Fennessy. Ann will tell you she left her office in Pioneer Square at 5 o'clock and barely made it here due to traffic and rerouting and power outages and all sorts of things. And Mike Sugg, our management analyst, who's been working on this project with Ann. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ann.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Good evening. I just want to let you know that the city of Issaquah doesn't have any power in its traffic lights either. So there's a lot of patience on the roads right now.
Do they not have battery backup on their power?
I don't know. And they didn't have any police officers either.
My goodness. Well,
But there's lots of trees down. But everything looked great in Sammamish. It was easy once I got here. Okay, so once again, I'm Ann Fennessy of Cocker Fennessy. We were retained by the city to come in and do a communications assessment, and what we have before you this evening is a summary, a high-level summary of what we found and recommendations that we are making to the city. Please feel free, if you have questions as we go through this, to ask me. I've done this briefing for some of your colleagues for the Communications Committee, but please feel free if you have questions. So I just touch here.
And I will point out that the actual full draft of the recommendation of the study is included in your packet under attachment 2.
Okay, so basically, we're going to go through the findings, our recommendations. We're going to talk about what we heard from the individuals we talked to and what suggestions they made, and then finally, we will, what we're doing tonight in the process is presenting it to you. So our goal was to evaluate how effective the communications currently is at the city of Sammamish and what your best practices are. Put together a list of prioritized improvements, what you're doing well, and what we think you could have areas for improvement, and also be practical about the implementation strategy. This is not something you can do overnight, but actually I think is a cultural change, and so we've made some recommendations on what you should be doing immediately and longer term. The way we approached getting input was we interviewed all members of the city council. We interviewed 25 members of your staff. We reviewed past public opinion research that has been conducted for the city of Sammamish, as well as did some additional interviews for people outside of City Hall. We also thought it would be helpful to look at some of the peer cities that are similar in some of the issues facing you, as well as size and budget, but not totally. And so we talked with reviewed 5 other cities and what their communication structure, plans, and materials and outreach efforts were. And then we also looked over your materials that you currently have, what kind of media coverage, both social and traditional media. We reviewed your website, looked at what were your consistency and how you approached the brand of the city of Sammamish, and then we reviewed other survey research. What we found over kind of the top level is that there is a strong desire by the council, the staff, and the community to improve your focus on which audiences and making sure you're using the right communication tools and techniques to actually reach those audiences. So not one size fits all, but being a little bit more specific to the changing demographics and how they get information, as well as your traditional media sources. There was also a strong desire to improve your transparency so people could find out the information in the community and find out information among some of the staff people to build better trust of what City Hall is up to. People also felt that a lot of the current activities you're involved in are a little bit more reactive when it comes to communications rather than proactive. So you are at times hearing frustrations from the community, not because you're doing something, but they feel like they are catching up rather than you being more proactive. And then overall, trying to have a broader outreach, not just the same old folks who come to City Hall meetings or the same old folks who do all the tweets and emails, but can you actually reach the broader community and get their input? On the right is the details that kind of go through the top 4 points that I was making on it, but it really is that people felt good that you were having this assessment and wanted you to improve your communications. On the structure of your organization, it is very clear that you have been consciously thoughtful about being a very lean and streamlined communications function, that you have instituted the responsibility throughout City Hall not just in one or two people, that everybody is responsible, that you, so it's a shared responsibility, it's decentralized, but that has led to having lots of different voices and different ways of talking about things. So for the people who are receiving it, it can be confusing, or some people may be up to date who is giving information, and other people may not be as up to date because you don't have a clear accountability section in that. And so there is, even though the decentralized model is there and people are trying to do it, there is some confusion and some duplication at times around it. And you don't have a consistent approach because you have everyone involved. And so staff, most of your staff also has other duties and responsibilities, so I wouldn't say that. I think your staff needs to have a better sense of how to communicate, some additional training, maybe some brand guidelines to be more consistent with the public. So there's not such different voices and information. Currently, you are using a wide variety of communications tools. You go from print newsletters to tweets to sandwich boards to the website. So you have lots of different things. And so one of the things we are going to be recommending has to do with how do you make your print newsletter more effective and more timely. I think we heard from both staff, council, and the community that there are really interesting, important issues being talked about and dealt with in the city and in the community, but we aren't as timely as we could be on some of that. And so we need to figure out how do we become more proactive on it and figure out better ways to engage and listen to the community in a way that is not clumsy or cumbersome to either the staff or the council. You may, with some of the recommendations we make, there may be additional thoughts that need to be discussed, especially when it comes to public records requests and compliance issues. But I think your colleagues have done it, so I think it's an easy bridge to cross. And finally, I know that you have invested time and energy already in updating your website, but I think you need to go back to that because I think it's only partway there, and we need to do a better job to make it easier for people to use the information and gather it. So, in our recommendations, we have broken them down into 4 key areas. One is work smarter, not harder. You don't have to do all the things you're currently doing, but we need to be a little bit more strategic about how to do that. And, we also should be very clear on how do we talk about the city of Sammamish and what sort of, how do we be consistent in the tone of our communications and to train to a certain extent our staff and our public on how and what kind of communications we are going to use. So for instance, on a night like tonight, where there could be roads closed because of power or trees or drainage issues, having people realize that there's an alert system, that maybe it's even the color red, that will help them to understand that that is a very different communication than what could be coming up to sign up for the parks function. So being consistent on how do we want to get timely information out and what kind of information out. And that will help your staff be able to, and your community to be able to understand what they need to immediately look at and what they have some time to look at. We also really are recommending to take a more proactive approach, and we also think you need to think about the communications resources you currently have. We think you're a little light, especially since you have grown over the last 4 or 5 years, not just in population, but I think also in some of the issues that are, and the complexity of the issues that you're facing. So we're recommending some additional communications capacity, but also remaining very cost-effective to do that. So overarching, we think it's really important that you reframe the communication function throughout the city so that there is a clear understanding of what the duties and responsibilities are for everyone, and also where they can get support and help from people within the city on that. We need to really be clear on who are the audiences that we are trying to reach out to. On the right side of the slide, we really talked about some of the key audiences, the people who are currently engaged, the people who are benefiting but may not be engaged in giving you input, and those who will be affected by any of the decisions you make, and trying to get them earlier in on the process. So you're not hearing stop, stop, stop. You haven't heard my point of view when you get to your decision-making process. So try to figure out how to do that more earlier. We also recommend that you are doing some things well, and that you should acknowledge those. It's not as if you have coals in your stockings. You are actually doing some things really well. And we think those are the areas you should be focusing on in the next year or two. And then a lower priority is whether or not you want to, at this current time, to do a pilot project on some kind of issue-focused campaign that could help train everybody how to best do that.
I'd support the pilot projects.
You do? Okay. Okay.
Don't fall for that one, Ann.
It's an inside joke.
I'm sure it's an inside joke, and I'm glad I can get you to laugh at one. Okay. Okay. On structure, we think it's important that we be very specific on identifying who are the key people within your different departments that take on that responsibility, that will be kind of the in-house lead. They don't have to do all the work, but they are the people that would be trained and help facilitate and monitor the communications coming from each one of those departments. We also recommend increasing your central communication staffing. You currently have basically one full-time person and in-house, and then someone who is on contract. We recommend that you consider going to 1.5 to 2, depending on over time, to really help solidify and train and get people ready to be consistent with their outreach, and most importantly, getting input back to you so you can make informed decisions. And we also think it's really important to put together, we call it a how-to fact sheets, but some basic templates to help help people in the city learn how to communicate. You have very, very capable, smart staff people who want to share everything they know at times, and sometimes the public only wants to know the highlights and not all the details. So we have to figure out, how do we talk about the highlights so people can get a sense of the issues, but give people also the ability, for those who need more details, how to get them, but not try to educate everybody at the same time, at the same level, with each little dot and I. And on the right, you'll see empowering the team, some of the steps that we're talking about, including doing some training and coaching with staff, as well as developing a yearly editorial calendar. So we are planning on what we're going to be talking about throughout the year, instead of just at the last minute. Recommendations with tools and techniques. I have a couple of slides on that. We think it's a high priority to develop an annual communications work plan, which would be tied to the editorial calendar that I just mentioned. We think it's really important to focus on your website and making it a little bit more user-friendly, improve the search engine, and making sure you test the usability. Right now, it's really inconsistent depending on department and issue. So I think it's really important that we can help people find information more quickly, and then if they need to dig down into it, how to find it. We also think it's important that you restructure your email system. Currently, you have many, many lists of people in your community who are interested in different issues, and so they get email blasts, but we think they get email blasts at time on issues that they don't care about, and then other times they don't get blasted on the issues they do care about. So internally, I think we can do some shaping of some of those and revising some of those email alerts so it can be more effective, so people know what they want and how they're getting it. We also think it's important to put together on item 14 some guidelines around social media, how to use it, when to use it, what is the tone of voice, what's appropriate for it and what is not, and how to make sure that whatever we're doing meets the state public records requirements. And I think you have a fabulous woman, I believe, who is helping you with your social media. And I think we need to integrate her more into what's happening in City Hall. And I think just being off-site, I know she's on-site right now helping in the transition you're in, but I think it's really important that that's integrated more with the messages and the high issues that you're wanting public input on. Okay. Second, medium priority is something I mentioned a little earlier, and that was building the brand consistency and identity to make sure that it is easy for people to understand that it's coming from the city of Sammamish, and then at what level of importance it is. Is it basic information? Is it an emergency alert? Is it a sign up for something in the Parks Department? That kind of level. We also think you need to think about whether or not you need to do a monthly print newsletter. It's a high cost to you. It's a lot of work. That doesn't mean you should be pulling back on your communications to the public, but maybe there's a way to take some of the resources that you are currently spending on the print newsletter and develop that into a monthly or weekly electronic newsletter. You have a really sophisticated group of people who live in this community who are used to doing digital media, and I think we need to, it doesn't mean to get rid of the print newsletter overall, but there may be a way to broaden who's reading it by also thinking about some, transferring some of the funds that you are currently using on that to a weekly newsletter. We also think that there needs to be
Excuse me, I heard two messages you said.
Okay, sorry.
Originally, I heard you say reduce the print, and then you said not to. Can you please elaborate a little bit more?
Absolutely, I'm sorry, then I misspoke. The frequency, I don't think you need to send 12 print newsletters out a year. I think you could reduce that depending on how you want to use the newsletter. And so I think that if you did, and this would be something that would have to be part of the communications plan that we talked about earlier and the editorial plan, think about what your printed newsletter is not necessarily a timely piece. So there are more timely ways of getting out information electronically if you have situations or issues that can be raised that aren't as programmed or predictable that you can use for the print newsletter. Does that answer it?
It does.
Okay.
Councilmember Jerem?
I don't agree, but it does.
Okay, that's all right. I think people like getting the printed newsletter. I don't want to say that the printed newsletter is not valuable. I'm just wondering if you want to, with the same amount of resources, whether you want to do it every month. You could do it 6 times a year. You could do it 9 times a year and take some of those funds and put it into some other electronic pieces. I don't think you should get rid of it overall. I think it's an important piece that people feel good about getting. And it's a good reminder that you and Sammamish are doing what you can give, that you are doing things.
And Councilmember Jerem has a
Oh, sorry, sure.
Thanks. One point about the print newsletter is we use it for inserts like spring activities or summer activities, also budget and brief. So, it might be quarterly with more content in it. The inserts plus more individual proactive items. And I agree with weekly or monthly
Right.
electronic newsletter as the supplement.
Right. Yeah, I think if we are more strategic about what that printed newsletter can be and how we want to use it and what kind of information on it, I think that is the real discussion to have. So if it's about getting the budget in it, and we know it's coming out every year. I don't know, I assume it's September or October that you have that kind of information go out. Then let's plan for it on an annual basis, and let's talk about what we need to have in it on the spring insert. Or if you have a calendar of events every quarter for the city. I mean, those are the kinds of things that you want in a hard printed copy, but you also want to have that electronically available too, not one or the other. We also think it's important, right now it is hard for you to know, on number 20, all of the kinds of questions of issues and who is coming to your website or calling in. And so we think there's some programs that can help you actually gather data about the issues, where what part of town people live in, what they're interested in, all those kinds. So you can actually start to see whether or not you can monitor that data and get a better sense of evaluating whether your communication is working or not. So when we talk about improved citizen customer engagement tracking, it's not to know the individual, it's more important to know what issues are important, but not that it's Ann Fennessy's issue, but it may be this neighborhood, it might be throughout the community, it might be only on traffic, but a better way for you to actually have some metrics and data to look to find out what people are contacting City Hall about. We know from some of the website data we get, and this is part of the reason why we need to make the website more friendly and usable, is people drop off because they can't find the information. And so we need that kind of data to find out what's working and not working on your communications and what issues people care about and what they don't.
And I might be jumping ahead or bits or pieces of this, but the
Sure.
analytics that you're talking about right
Yes.
now. So are you talking cross-platforms then too? So
Yes.
the website would accumulate some data where, another tool that was being used, would that be manually inputted? I guess where it could be entered by the user, it would be collected that way, but would we actually manually be entering information if it was collected from phone calls?
It might be, yes. Which is not
Is that the dashboard that you were talking about?
Yes.
That's actually the tool that you're looking at?
well, the dashboard is a roll-up of the tools you would use. I don't have all the tools off the top of my head, but there are different ways of different kinds of data that you could use. One, it can also be who's going on Facebook and what are the issues that are coming on Facebook. I mean, that's a different analytic right now that we can't figure out. So it's not just your phone calls and it's not just your website, but is to look at all the platforms that people either are talking to you directly or people are talking about you in the blog sphere, right? And then you would use a dashboard to show what those results are.
So if you don't mind me just asking, so for example, Facebook, there's probably no interface with Facebook that would come in there, or is there an electronic interface that would capture that data, or would that would again be our communications department would be gathering that data and entering it into this analytic tool?
Well, you can get data from Facebook on how many hits you get and all of that sort of stuff. You can get that already. Now, you can't
It's
get
not
it to
just
the
number
level
of
of
hits.
detail.
I'm talking about category, the type of
Yeah.
the type of information.
Yeah, and I
Subject
don't know
matter.
off the top of my head. If Vanessa was here tonight, she could answer that, but I don't know. But that, it would go back to your communications people. And so the question becomes, how do you want those communications people to spend their time? It may not be worth the Facebook data collection if they have to do it. It may be a lower priority. And we first start at a higher priority and just on your website. You don't have to do all of this overnight at all. And that's why we need to have the conversation on what can, we know currently that I think your website is the foundation of all your communications for the city. It's used internally between the staff, and it's also where your community goes to get information. So the first place I would go is to make sure that is clear and that data collection and analytics is the best we can get.
Thank you, Ann. Councilmember Valderrama has a question.
Yeah, I assume now we're starting to engage on these slides, or I
Yeah.
thought we were going to wait till the end on that. I am also
almost
concerned
done.
about the marginal value of the data that we're collecting when you start to go in and how much we're spending and what we're really getting out of it. And you can also get diverted because you can be watching Facebook, but you're only watching 5 or 6 people who
Correct.
this is a key, and it's a squeaky wheel, but doesn't in any way represent the city. Going back to the print medium, since we've been talking about that, one concern I have about reducing the frequency is when we have special issues like the moratorium. When the moratorium came out, we have a large percentage of our city that looks at the newspaper and the newsletter as the main source. So on the moratorium, if you went to a quarterly basis, would they have to wait till the next quarter issue come out to it? And it's a very significant number of our percentage of our citizens that only look at the print medium. Even people in 40s and 50s that I've met that are still looking at the print media out there. So we've got to balance that out as to the habits. And they may use the RSS to get the alerts on the street, but still want to see that physical. So it behooves us to be very careful if we're going to be changing that frequency, or to be telling people, if you want the most up-to-date information, you've got to search on multiple medias. It should be consistent in all the medias. My 2 cents.
No, thank you. Thank you. Now, it's good that you followed up on the newsletter, because that's how this conversation started. But maybe we could go back to you presenting, and then
Sure.
we'll ask our questions at the end again.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
A lower priority, it doesn't mean these things aren't important, but it's not where you need to start right now, and that is to have your materials and your look a little bit more visually compelling, and translating your materials into more languages to reflect your residents. And then think about some pilot projects that might be, we have the pilot joke again, the pilot projects to, or some innovative approaches to see if they work. So implementation, we have broken out what we think, how do I say this? We have put together a chart that lays out, or a graph that lays out what the implementation is, and it's based on priority, based on what we heard through interviews and our experience, as well as best practices, to the timeline on how long it would take to complete once it starts. So there may be something that you see starting soon, but it won't be completed for quite some time. And third, estimate of the costs to implement the recommendation. In the draft communication strategy, if you want to go into more detail, it's on page 16, but that's what our chart tried to describe. So you will see here that our high priority recommendations are reframe the communications function, identify audience and focus, address the communications basics first, and celebrate successes. We think those can be done, most of those can be done within the next year, and the mid is from the next year to 3 years, okay? And all under $10,000. Is this making sense to folks? Structural recommendations, oops, did I touch something? I did. Structural recommendations also are short-term, so in the next 1 to 2, in next year. And it is also fairly cost-effective. There is some cost depending on if you want to increase your central communications staffing. That is definitely something that would cost somewhere between $100,000 or more, depending at what level. And then finally, the high priority recommendations on tools and techniques, as you will see. Also, most of those are short-term, like developing the plan and the editorial calendar, restructuring your databases so they can be more effective, and developing the social media guidelines, all very cost-effective. Then when we start getting into updating the website and enhancing your digital assets, it's going to take 1 to 3 years, and it's going to cost you, depending on how detailed and how specific you want to go, especially on the website. I think it's going to take some time, but I think it's going to be worth the financial investment to make that site a lot more user-friendly and a lot more easy to navigate and to find information. Do you want me to go through all the medium and short too? Or do you want me to just go to questions? Anyone? I can go through
They're
these.
close. Why don't you go through this and then we'll
Okay,
we'll
great.
have questions.
So this is, once again, this is a wrap-up of what you've just seen. It's just been broken out into a way that talks about how long we think it could take and what the cost estimates are. So structural recommendation over the next 1 to 3 years, finishing in 3 years, the communications and how do we figure out how to share that internally better. And then on tools and techniques, not as high a priority as the other ideas that we talked about, but to look at how do we create guidelines, how do we have that conversation about the printed media to make sure we're being thoughtful about how do we reach out to the community on printed or digitally, and then also how do we create that dashboard so we can figure out where we are now, and as we change certain approaches and we use new tools, are we changing any kind of, is the dashboard showing that we're making any impact or not? The citizen and customer engagement tracking is a little longer term, and it would cost a little bit more money, and we would need to go into what are the metrics we care about, and how do we best, because you could go into a level of data that you don't really want to spend that money or energy on. So we really should be clear about what it is we want to find out, and then to figure out what it would take in terms of both staff and programming to figure out how to implement it, okay? Lower recommendations is investing in an issue-focused campaign, and then tools and techniques is translations and more visual approach.
So,
Questions?
Mr. Mayor,
We have some questions right now.
could I just make a quick comment? The room is very cold tonight. I wanted to apologize. We lost power about an hour ago. We have an air handler unit down. This is not our attempt to torture you all with freezing cold temperatures. We haven't been able to turn it back on. So unfortunately, it will be chilly tonight, and I apologize.
We'll see how long we stay.
Exactly. Will keep us awake. Okay, so the first question is Councilmember Huckabee.
Yes, for many years I've talked about how do we translate the materials, and we've had some discussions about that. If you have any ideas of how it works, because we've been told that that it's very difficult to translate and to get an accurate translation
Right, that's the
in many different languages. And we have a very high population of Chinese, East Indian, and others. And so any ideas you have in that direction would be really welcome.
Okay. Yeah, it really is an issue. So Google Translation is something that people use all the time.
Yes.
And that's the question of accuracy. And so the question really becomes, what's the investment you want to put in for having an individual who is skilled in translation, paying them to make sure the documents that you want translated are done well. But I don't think there's an easy or inexpensive way to do an accurate translation. What some other cities have done is they have made a decision on establishing what priority materials and information they want done, and then they just put that in the budget and say, this is what we're going to translate.
Okay, we have
Thank
Deputy-
you, that's really helpful because it's probably more important to let people know that there's a storm coming and the winds are blowing and trees are going down than it is necessary to let them know that we're going to have a party at Sammamish Nights in 3
Right.
weeks. Yeah.
we have Deputy Mayor Malchow and then Councilmember Hornish.
So first on the newsletter, we had a little bit of discussion on scaling back maybe the printed version. And I know that we had, I don't know, it may have been in part virtual town hall, and I think part of it may have been a statistically valid survey where we asked people
Yes.
about whether or not they liked it. And I think there were quite a few that liked it. I'm very
Absolutely.
supportive of the electronic version, and I think over time we may find that we can change behavior from desiring that printed copy and slowly move ourselves over to a digital format for that, because there is a relevance to information that's much more timely than what we're able to produce. I know Issaquah does exclusively online, and it's weekly. And I think it's helpful to have slightly more timely information. On that end, I'm curious, do we know what percentage of people in our city have internet access at home? I mean, I know there's the library, but...
I believe you have that information. I don't have it off the top of my head.
That may just, the
Right.
reason I brought that up is that would simply provide a venue for people to obtain an electronic newsletter. I mean, you could send out a tangible newsletter that says, we're moving to an electronic newsletter.
Right.
And here's where it'll be. One thing that I didn't hear during this presentation that we had at the Communications Committee, which I thought was really important, was that we talked about the website in terms of a central repository and having everything lead back there. So whether it's Twitter or Facebook or whatever, it's all driving people back to our central repository, which is our website, which should have all this information. I firmly believe we need to do another overhaul of our website. From an aesthetic standpoint, it looks great, it's just not functional. I'm one of those people who goes in the search bar and I'm like, I can't find it. And I know a lot of people have that same frustration. That's leading to phone calls to staff, emails to staff, and that's a time suck for staff in general. Speaking of staff, I do have a question on that. You talked in the presentation about adding staff, and I kind of heard it on two different ends, and so I'm hoping for a little bit of clarification. Originally, I thought when we had our communications committee that we talked about the staffing ad would be on that website end. Is that where you're thinking we're needing staff? Because I also heard need on the social media side. So can you clarify?
So when we did this work, you still had a full-time communications manager. So actually, right now, you have the ability to, I think, to be flexible on what skills you need in the person you hire. But what I would say is you need someone who is strategic, who can overall put together a communications plan, and someone who is able to work with their colleagues to leverage how you communicate, and then someone who is either overseeing or I can't stress enough how important your website is and how it has to be functional and it has to be understandable. And so I'm not sure if you need that in your communications manager or if you need that as a consultant or whatever, but those functions have to be approached. And so I would say back to you, since you have this ability right now, the flexibility of hiring someone to think about making sure you have someone who's skilled enough to deal with the bigger picture, but also realizes how to get the website and the social media piece done well, and how they can work and help their colleagues in City Hall leverage their communications better.
So from a priority standpoint, at least I'm seeing here, and it sounds like you're saying that the website is by and
Way up
large
there.
at the top, and then
Yeah.
social media is falling somewhere
Correct.
behind that. And,
Yes.
and I would support the notion that we need to get the website, because that leads to the social media person being able to use
Right.
it as a central repository, because
Right.
right now we're just kind of
Right.
all over the place.
I will say that how you have used your social media, especially during emergencies, has been very effective. So there's also some of the emergency piece that you need to continue to do, but I agree with you. I think an overall communications plan will also help.
Councilmember Sammamish?
Excuse me?
And then Valderrama.
Yes, I just want to say thank you. I think you've done a yeoman's task to do the overall assessment and the plan that you put together, and I really like how you set forth the priorities. You kind of answered the question I had initially: who's going to do this? And it sure as heck isn't council. So I'm looking at staff in that regard, but you talked about that already. One question I have for staff: how much did we spend on the last website overhaul, so to speak, in the last year?
Was actually, we got a very good value for that, because the overhaul was basically just to change the technology. And so the functionality was supposed to come later. We cleaned it up. It's now basically ripe to update and increase the functionality. I think we actually spend in the neighborhood of $35 to $50 million.
50 million?
Or 50,000, sorry. Wow, sorry.
That contract.
Yeah, sorry. Whoa! In the neighborhood between
Do it cheap, $5 million.
$35,000 and $50,000.
I thought it was
And-
85,000 for some
and-
reason. Yeah.
I can double check that, but I know we really held the consultants' feet to the fire in developing it, because they did not make any money on us at all.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, they lost money on us.
Well, the only reason I'm asking is because I was very supportive of doing that, but I realized we need to do more. So I'm very supportive of making this the highest priority, and it's going to cost some money, which kind of leads into my next question. Is all of this kind of, from staff's point of view, incorporated into the 2018 yet?
No, none
No.
of it.
Will it be next week?
We can give you some estimates for next week and have a separate discussion if you would like to do that. The other option is we do have operating contingency as well, so you can give us some direction.
Well,
moving
the one
forward.
concern I have is the website with $3 signs on it.
No. So it's going to be, to put that much effort into it, it's probably north of probably $100,000.
Right. So I mean,
to
I
really
think
make
that's
it-
something we ought to
really make it
include as a line
functional.
item. Yeah.
I would say so.
Okay.
But to make it fully functional, I think it would be a good investment.
And I think that would be in 1 year too, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Correct.
And
I would hope.
could you talk a little bit about, in the previous discussions, we had decided that essentially what we're trying to do is to, from a time standpoint, get a head start, a jump on it, get things implemented, and then we would then shift more into a maintenance mode.
Correct.
Where we can actually keep things up. So it may be, for example, bringing somebody on board to do it, but it would be a limited term position.
Correct. Right.
Would be a good way to look at it.
okay, front loaded.
Yeah. Absolutely. You want it, and you also want it to be timely, so you want to get it functional as quickly as you can, and that's going to take resources. And once you have that up, and you have also at the same time, you've started to coach and train staff on how to use and write for it, you can then maintain it.
Yeah.
But you're going to have to
I'm
front
guessing
load
3
it.
to 6 months to kind of redo it, so
Yes.
to speak. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to ask a quick question, but first, we'll next have Councilmember Valderrama, Jaron, and then Huckabee. 3 questions for you, Ann. But my question, just for a time check, for presentation, will there be more presentation
No.
for tonight? So that
Not
you're
for
done
me.
with that piece of it? Okay. Very good. Thank you. Okay, so Councilmember Valderrama.
Yeah, thank you again for the assessment that you've done and the time you've taken. A couple quick points on the current goals, objectives, and outcomes. We talk about a desire to get ahead of controversial items. One thing that occurred to me that I personally don't think we do enough is celebrate the achievements of the city. I think that's something, as much as getting ahead of the controversial, is making people be aware of what we have succeeded. You talk about, on the following slide, current organizational model. questions raised about council and staff roles. What did that entail?
There has been a confusion at times, I think, on what staff should be. So how do you make sure council gets its messages out on a timely fashion on how to staff that? Then there is what the city manager and the department directors, what are they supposed to get out? And we just need to make sure we have kind of, guidelines on what council should be doing and what city staff and city management should be doing and talking about. Because I think you have you as council members have a different role than the staff who is implementing
Exactly.
your policies.
Exactly. Thank you. On the website, I have an issue that I think all the citizens have gone through this modernization effort. They thought it was the end-all, be-all. We spent money, we announced it, and as Christy had mentioned, the functionality is actually worse than the last one. The search engine is far worse than our last website that we had out there. So we have this problem that we've put money into this, and to make sure that we understand how this is going to be utilized and the foundation. Well, we may say that that's not how it's being perceived. The audio-visual equipment and how much we spend on this audio-visual is constantly ridiculed because we constantly have it going down, sound problems and that. And so there's a credibility problem right now that I notice with the citizens when we're putting into technology. So how do we avoid that same credibility issue coming back again, especially at this time? Third, I think we have an issue here where a lot of citizens, and I'll be the first of them to come out, is needs versus wants and for our city. And we have a structural fiscal imbalance. We're not dealing, this council, with the issue of the budget. And we don't have time to talk about the budget, we're told, but we have time to talk about communications. We're constantly looking at staff coming up and saying we need more staff for communications, we need more staff for the parks, we need more staff to help out on arts. And how do we do that without having analyzed our budget? How can we start addressing any of these issues without having that framework of the budget and how we're going to address the coming deficit that we all know? And some are now saying that the deficit already is here and that we're not recognizing it in the capital money that's getting, budget getting money from it. So I have a real concern of supporting anything of this nature without having that budget, because it looks like we're constantly looking at our wants instead of the real needs. I'd rather see more money being going into the transit solution, the traffic concurrency. I'd rather see more money going into stormwater, but we have no framework to weigh these priorities at this point until that's going. So that is a real concern of mine that's in the backdrop that we have to come to that realization and face that issue here and in this budget and in the next one. My 2 cents.
Great. Next, Councilmember Jaron.
Thank you. To follow up on Romero's 2 cents, it's going to take more than 2 cents.
Yes.
But I do support the improvements to the website. I agree with what's said. You have to have a place where you know you can get the information, and and the citizens are, at least in our community, rely more on their smartphone than on the printed media. So I'm supportive of improving the website. I'm also supportive of, as you said, putting together a communication master plan and a team effort and branding so that we use the same branding throughout. The timing on that, that's up to next year's budget and council. To get down into minutia, we do have an AM radio communication, which hasn't been discussed at all. The last time I turned it on, it really didn't say anything other than saying it was AM radio. Shouldn't we have a message on there, at least say in case of emergency, you will hear it here? I don't think it says that anymore. Mike, do you know?
I'm not sure about the AM radio station.
At one point in time, the message did say, if there is an emergency, tune into the station. So we'll verify that. If that message somehow got changed, we'll put back what needs to be there.
Okay, and that might be something you see on the website and in the from time to time in the newsletter that we have an AM radio station. In terms of the budget, well, that's next week. And when are the inputs for budget changes supposed to be into you, Lyman?
Wednesday of this week.
Wednesday. Okay. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Councilmember Huckabee.
Yes, thank you. I think you did a really great job on this. Some thoughts and concerns that I have. You had talked about the website, which I think is a real critical piece. And yes, I do have problems with the search function, so I just go to Google and type what I want, and it, I was looking at something for the piece on the erosion hazard overlay today. So by typing it in Google, I go right to that page as opposed to going to the website.
Right.
That is not a good thing. One should be able to go to the website to do that if someone's looking for it. But the one question that the one comment I take issue with is that if we get the website functional and we train our staff to use it, that things will all be fine. We have a very small staff.
Right.
They really don't have the time, and that has led to council responding a lot to members of the community when they write in. We all have our own version of the events. It's not that anybody's doing something good or bad.
Correct.
It's just we have our own version. And those things, then sometimes you end up with a longer conversation and people are more confused than they are clear about some issues. From my perspective, we have a community that doesn't pay a whole lot of attention. And we need to find a way to provide them with information that they can use. For example, 2 weeks ago, somebody wrote in and said, well, they had all this construction equipment on their streets, and why weren't we dealing with that? We have that as a problem, so how do we communicate to the community that this is not acceptable and that we need their eyes and ears out there to write back to us? Not when they get so frustrated that they are just totally angry, but that this is the way we have to do business. We have to partner with our community to have them bring us information so we can act on it. It's not that we're ignoring that information. So that's where I kind of am real concerned about how do we get those kinds of pieces of information out to the community? How do we really grab their attention?
Right.
Because we find that, again, that's a lot of the candidates, I bet if you talk to them, and they've been out doorbelling, and the misinformation and the misunderstandings are sometimes really profound, and it's really hard to get that turned around in the community. So I would see that if we had a communications person who was putting information together and pulling it from the various departments and helping to script that and provide that, I think it would be much more functional, much more interesting, and I think people would tend to pay more attention to it than if we have everybody trying to just put out bits and pieces of information.
Right. So the idea of putting together that communications team within each department was not to say that they would be all on their own, but actually to develop some of their skills and then to work with the communications lead, the central communications lead. So it wasn't just the communications lead's responsibility. And you have a decentralized system that there were definitely some people who said, I would love to give that all back to them.
Right.
But because you have people out in the community, whether it's somebody working on the roadway or not, they need to know what's happening because that's who they're going to ask. So they have to have some training too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Very good, Ann. I have no more questions here on my board, so is there anything that you wanted to add?
I want to say that I think you guys do a really good job, and especially with how limited the amount of funds you have spent compared to your peer cities on communications. I believe in our final report, we have actually a matrix that shows what your peer cities, how much staff, how much money, what their budgets are, what their population is, what they're good at and what they're not good at. And I think you guys are just catching up. But one of the things I was really impressed about is to see that the council and the staff both wanted the same thing. So you're not starting at opposites. You're actually both wanting to be more proactive, to get your citizens more engaged, and to be more transparent. And that right there is a huge step that some cities don't have. So build on that.
Okay.
Very much for that
You bet.
report.
And one of the things that she recommended is that we celebrate our achievements, so let's just celebrate that right now. Thank you, Ann.
Anything else?
We appreciate all your
Thank
help
you.
and the effort that you put in, and also thank you to your team. You have a very good team and were very helpful to
Yeah.
us, so thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Be careful on your drive. home
I
tonight.
shall. Since I have a bum hand, I can't drive, so my husband was sweet enough to drive me.
Stay away from Issaquah.
Thanks.
Okay, and with that, Mr. City Manager, we're going to make a switch, I guess, for the
Do you need
final
a-
subject.
Do you need a break, or are you good?
We'll take an early break.
Okay, we're going to have a real 5-minute break. Sure. 10 minutes to 8, please.
Did you get my message yesterday? The one that said
Tom?
We're gonna get out of here early.
no.
Yeah, we're 15 minutes late
It's
right
only- it's
now.
only-
And this, we're going to be,
No, we're actually
this,
we're 10 minutes ahead.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because if you backed up everything an hour, we were supposed to be starting the stormwater at 8.
Last weekend.
So we were only 15 minutes of public.
yeah, but
But I think
it
stormwater
says
is
adjourned.
a half hour, yeah.
No, see, this was screwed up. That's why I was screwed up. This is a new agenda. See, it was the 7th was our agenda. It was
okay.
at 5:30, and so
he's got a
now it's
full
got
hour.
at 8:30.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So I'm gonna count yours though. That's my time.
You're right. Hey, Pam.
I had to dig out as many flashlights as I could because my dogs were freaking out. And my kids left to go find Wi-Fi. So they
Did you
could
lose
complete-
power completely, or-
Yeah.
yeah.
So they were trying to find Wi-Fi so they could finish their homework. My husband was out, and I was like, and the dogs were freaking out. So I'm like strategically setting up flashlights
For them.
Dogs and everybody. I'm like, seriously?
Now,
And then there was a treat out on Southeast Fourth, so I
Yeah.
didn't know where we're at.
Yep, we were on that one.
Yeah.
yeah, you're talking about your dogs freaking out. We have this dog that's 10 months old. We've had him for 5 months, and the red light. When you do the
yeah,
light,
yeah.
he is so sold and so in on that, more than any dog that I've had
I
before.
can't hire a puppy too.
But I'm worried about this because now, if there are shadows on the ceiling, I'm not even talking the red light. If there's stuff going on in the room, you can see him, his head is up and he's tracking things around the room, and it's really, it's like he's seeing spirits,
Well, I hadn't had a chance to talk to you. Congratulations.
Right. I was talking to Chris today. I'm like, I need to sit down and talk.
Yeah, well, I've been meaning, and I was going to do it today, but I got lost in some other things to try to send out to everybody, both the people who won and the people who didn't win, because I want those people to stay engaged too. But we do need to sit down. You kind of free rest of this week sometime, or can I use your campaign email? Is that?
Actually, I have email now. I have it.
Oh, you have it here already. Oh, okay.
So I'll send you a mail.
Good.
I think it's Pete Stewart, but I'll have to go check. I don't remember.
Probably. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, I'm actually every night but Wednesday night. Wednesday
Okay.
night I've got something.
And what time are you back home?
I'm usually home reasonably early, like 4,
Okay.
4:30.
Yeah, if we could do something
on the
around then,
easy
that would
side.
be good.
I tried to be
Okay.
on the early side.
Gotcha.
When my daughter was born, I tried to go back to work part-time, but Microsoft doesn't really do part-time, they just say they do.
Yeah. Well, most part-times are like that.
So the boss that I was gonna have said, why don't you just shift your schedule? So I did. I'd go in early in the morning so I could come home early in the
Gotcha.
afternoon, and my husband would do morning duty because we had a nanny.
Gotcha.
So you wanted to limit that because it was expensive enough. You
Yep,
didn't want to do that overtime.
Yep.
So I started working the early shift. If you will.
Okay.
And I just kind of maintain that, so.
Okay.
I'm pretty hardcore about leaving work by 4 o'clock for the
You're
rare.
beating a little bit of the rush.
Well,
maybe.
I do. I get home a lot faster. If leaving at 4 versus 5 is.
Oh yeah, I got. It's still out there. I take my daughter over to Bellevue for cheerleading, and she starts at. She usually get there about 6:30. I'm coming back 6:30, 6:40. And it is still backed up. It's just
Now,
ridiculous.
if I can get out at 3:30,
You will
then that's
fly home.
golden.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times, if I have a 3 or a 4 o'clock meeting, I'll just leave and take
Yeah.
them home. 'Cause
Yeah.
most of our meetings are scheduled.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. Yeah, actually, I've got some friends. He was in the house the other day. He goes, I gotta take this.
But now we're having trouble with our Wi-Fi at home, so.
Yeah, to your point, I just.
Comcast out last week trying to.
Oh, really? See, I just turned my son's AT&T back on because it was off because he was overusing it. And he goes, but I need to get the homework done, same as your kids. It's like, okay, fine, whatever.
I know. Okay, so I got a funny story. So last month, we get alerts when we hit 75% of our data usage for our Wi-Fi.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I'm getting these text alerts. I'm like, what the heck? So my mom and dad, when they retired, they moved into the middle of nowhere in Alabama. And so they didn't have decent Wi-Fi. And so I got her just a little Wi-Fi device, right, through AT&T, and that's her home Wi-Fi,
Yeah.
which isn't a problem, right? Normally. So I log on because I'm thinking my stupid teenage son is probably, what's he doing, right?
Watching videos.
No, it's my mom.
Really?
Mom, I'm like, Mom, what are you doing different this
Facebook.
month than you were last month? Like, what the heck?
Yeah.
She blew through almost 15 gigabytes of data last month.
Just watching videos of Saturday Night
I
Live.
think she started going to some websites that are a little shoddy, and my sister went to one of them, and she said, "Oh my God, Pam," she said, "when you go there, there's like videos everywhere." So she's probably got 4 or 5 tabs open, and all these videos are just running, and she has
leaves
no
them
idea.
run, yeah.
She has no idea what's going on.
Oh, excuse me, I'm going to take a quick break.
She still is amazed that she can come to my house and check her email from my computer. How did her email get on my computer? Like, your email's not on any computer, Mom.
Yeah.
It's in the proverbial cloud.
I still have a problem when I'll go up and I'll see my iPad and it has my emails. Oh, that's right. It's all sick. I said, how did that happen out there? Hey, by the way, I had coffee with Ratusha today.
Oh, did you? Oh, good.
Similar comments, a lot of things that she had to do.
So that is the cool seat, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Because at the
It's
last
by the windows.
forum, I almost, like, Emily kept telling me, she's like, "Mom, this one because I'm cool."
It's always.
Yeah, and the wind is,
Yes,
it's really.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was, when you moved, I was like,
Well, you feel like you were down in Siberia. Tom's.
And I could feel these gusts of wind coming.
it was so hard, it blew our front door even though it was locked. It blew it enough that the alarm sounded.
You probably did the same run we did, which was trade across South Sport.
Yes, I was a little bit late, because first I had to get the dogs from the set, because the kids went in search of Wi-Fi. So when I left home, there was nobody home, the dogs were totally freaked out.
Oh, I can imagine.
So I just
It'll
settled
get
the dogs.
even more freaked right in front of the house.
Yeah, with the trees, yeah, with the trees down.
And the flashing light.
Yeah.
So we had to pull the curtains behind us.
But we have a dog, he's a rescue, he's actually on Prozac, he has anxiety, he has anxiety.
Yeah, those dogs.
We have a dog too, but he's such an old man. Lovely man, I would much longer.
Prepare the girls for that.
Well, we lost one, not this past summer, but the summer before.
So maybe they were younger.
They didn't want to, we had it fed. I mean, it's better to do it. We have big dogs, so it's not like we're lifting. He couldn't even walk.
We were so pleased our other dog, we made an appointment. And in the morning, we sat there, just talked to the talking to we just got to cuddle him.
I so don't look forward to doing
No,
it
it's not.
again. It's just like so miserable.
We had German Shepherds growing up, and they would get displayed.
Yes.
And they couldn't even move, like they would whimper every time they would try to get up. And so my dad was a big
Okay, council. Let's go.
Oh, God.
Do we have staff ready? Okay.
I think we do. Also, I will report out that we have what I would term EOC, Emergency Operations Center Light, in operations here at City Hall. So the winds have died down, so some of the issues that Puget Sound Energy and crews, actually when it's dangerous, the wind is blowing too hard, they won't actually get out and clear everything.
Right.
So now they're going to be, because the winds have died down, they'll be starting to clear issues that are out there.
Good, yeah, they said the wind was going to die down about 7-ish.
But
so-
the internet's down right now.
Is it?
The heat's down.
Yeah, the heat's down.
Okay, all the more reason for us to get going.
Yes.
Yeah, and if Michelle Petiti were here, she'd make us stand up and do exercises.
exactly.
To warm up, so,
Well, we could do that if you'd like.
no, it's okay.
Okay, Mr. City Manager.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. So we are here tonight to discuss some stormwater code amendments that the Planning Commission has been working on, along with our Public Works Department. So let me turn things over to them at this point. So please.
Thank you, City Manager. Good evening, City Council members, Mayor, Deputy Mayor. My name is Tawny Delzell. I'm the Senior Stormwater Program Manager with Public Works. Beside me is Cheryl Paston, our Deputy Director. This evening, I will be discussing the Stormwater Code amendments for 2017. My presentation will have the following agenda. We'll first discuss a little bit of the project background, the public process that took place. We'll discuss the summary and recommendations of some key proposed Stormwater Code amendments, and then finally conclude with the next steps of the process. So on the background, in 2014, the City Council adopted an emergency ordinance within the Inglewood Historic Plat for stormwater regulations. It got codified in 2015. And what these regulations required was that it recognized that there were some developments in the Inglewood area specifically that were just skirting below the minimum thresholds for drainage review. At that time, it was 2,000 square feet in that area. So they were just proposing developments that were in the 1999 square foot range of impervious surface. The historic plat stormwater regulations put that limitation at 500 square feet of new plus replace impervious surface. And that threshold applied to both drainage review, so it allowed the city to review the plans for these developments, and it also applied to the requirement to provide a stormwater tight line through the landslide hazard area to a safe location. So that was the work that was done in 2014 and 15. In 2016, you recall that the City Council adopted a citywide stormwater code update, and we adopted the 2016 King County Surface Water Design Manual, along with requirements for low-impact development throughout the city. This process had a time constraint to it through our permit requirements from the Department of Ecology. We had to pass a stormwater code update by the end of 2016. And so we worked diligently to pass these updates. There were a lot of codes that we revised, and the City Council recognized that last year and asked the staff to go back and take a look at these stormwater code updates that we made, look how they were being implemented, and see if there were any changes that would be needed to them. At the same time, a number of the public came to the City Council meetings in 2016 and asked that the city relook at the Inglewood stormwater regulations. And so we did that as well. We started in May of this year, and we spoke with planners, development review engineers, builders, and the public to get their feedback on the existing code. what we found was that the existing code had a lot of various directions that it took development and development review. It was quite onerous to get through the permitting process, and we found that many developers, builders were applying for drainage adjustments through the adjustment process to prove their case so on a site-by-site basis. We then went to the Planning Commission, and we spent quite a bit of time with the Planning Commission with developing recommendations to revise or amend the stormwater code. One of the planning commissioners, Eric Brooks, he always has a question that he asks at every change to code amendments that we propose, and it's, what's changed since the last code revision that we made? Why are you bringing this up again? And the answer is that we've had experience in the last year with reviewing new stormwater permits, building permits, and trying to get through this process of coming up with both sound engineering judgment and also being able to protect the environmental codes that the Inglewood Historic Plat ordinance and the citywide stormwater code wanted us to protect. So we've had a lot of experience in the last year, and that is what has brought us to the stormwater code amendments that we're proposing at this time.
Can you elaborate on what that experience is?
There are specific single-family residential applications that have come in, and they have asked us for adjustments to the drainage requirements. For example, there is a home on Beaver Lake, which is part of a critical drainage area. They're trying to use low-impact development techniques on their property. The existing code requires them to put in a stormwater detention vault and a separate water quality treatment device because there are no exemptions to those core requirements in our existing code. Low-impact development mitigates for flow control and water quality. So we believe that there are good changes that can be made with our existing code. So that's one example.
Thank you.
So a little bit of the public process. We had a public open house May 25th. We spent some time introducing recommended code to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission deliberated twice during September 21st and the 5th in order to come up with a recommendation. Their recommendation, we started out with something different with what the staff proposed, and they recommended something more stringent. And I'll get to that as we review some of the key proposed amendments. But today, we're here with the City Council to discuss the Planning Commission's recommendations. So some of the key proposed amendments that I'll discuss tonight include the drainage review threshold, tightline exemption, the flow control and water quality exemptions, allowable discharges, and the Inglewood Historic Plat Ordinance.
Before we go any further, can we talk about when do we ask questions? Can we ask them on each of these items, or should we wait till the end of the entire presentation to ask any questions?
Council, for me, I think it works better if we let them go through the presentation and then come back.
Yeah, that's a lot faster.
Okay?
It'd be long anyway.
Great.
Okay.
So we'll ask that you go through the presentation and then we'll ask questions.
Okay, because I have a slide that says questions at the very end. So the first is drainage review thresholds in critical drainage areas. So what the existing code requires is that there's a drainage review threshold of 500 square feet of new plus replaced impervious surface in the Inglewood Historic Plat area. The existing code also requires drainage review at 0 threshold in critical drainage areas. So in areas that drain to Pine Lake, Beaver Lake, or in landslide hazard areas. There's an overlap. The light cream yellow is the landslide hazard drainage area. That's also within the Inglewood Historic Plat area. So there's some variation in the drainage review thresholds within these critical drainage areas. We want to make them consistent. We've set the threshold now. We've recommended the threshold to be set at projects that create 500 square feet or more of new impervious surface. And you'll recognize that this is just new impervious surface. It's not replaced. So for example, if a property owner wanted to replace their driveway with a new addition, and this is another experience, learning event that we had this last year, where a property owner wanted to come in and convert their existing driveway in Inglewood, and they wanted to provide a new addition, new bedroom for his daughter. He could not do that without building a tight line or without going through drainage review. So we purposely created the threshold at 500 square feet or more of new impervious and excluded the replaced impervious surface, with the knowledge that the surface water running off of the replaced impervious surface would be no change from what it is today.
Can you repeat that again?
So if we're trying to address stormwater discharge from impervious surfaces, and you already have an impervious surface and you're just replacing it with another impervious surface, you're not creating any new stormwater discharge issues. So we felt that that would be onerous, expensive, and require a lot of resources in order to move that project forward by requiring drainage review for
So you're saying that
a
incremental
target that we
addition-
weren't trying to address.
So the incremental addition is negligible? Is that what we're?
There would be no addition of stormwater when you replace an impervious surface with an impervious surface.
But you
There's no
mentioned
addition,
that
there's no
this
change.
particular project, you were adding both a bedroom and replacing the driveway.
Right.
So there was some incremental impervious.
They were adding a bedroom over an existing driveway. They wanted to replace an existing driveway and
Interesting.
put a bedroom on top of it. That's definition of replaced.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think we quite understood that the driveway, the bedroom would be
Yeah.
placed over the driveway. Okay.
I'm kind of moving on to tightline exemptions in landslide hazard drainage areas. The recommendation that we have is to allow some tightline exemptions under specific conditions. And the conditions would have to both balance protection of landslide hazard areas and the development of rights of private property owners. So an example, or sorry, a rationale was that many builders wanted to provide a tight line through these areas, but they could not get easements through other private properties in order to provide that easement. So these neighboring private properties could effectively deny a development next to them by not allowing a tight line easement through their property. Also, we met with the city legal counsel, and they reviewed the current regulations that we have. They determined that current regulations may limit the reasonable use of a legal lot and may initiate a takings claim of the city. We also require that new development consider cumulative impacts under full build-out conditions. So you cannot just add a new impervious surface and direct the discharge onto your neighbor's property. You would have to figure out a way to get it to an acceptable discharge location, like an adjacent open ditch, or use LID. And then finally, the last rationale is that a small house or a small addition would be feasible without a tight line. Here's an example. So this lot is located in a landslide hazard drainage area. Under the drainage review threshold, drainage review would be required if 500 square feet or more of new impervious was added. So under the conditions, Public Works would have to approve an alternate system for stormwater discharge. A geotechnical engineer would have to analyze the cumulative impacts under full build-out of this proposal. And the house or addition would have to be less than 1,000 square feet of new impervious surface. This threshold is a high bar in order to achieve. There may be areas in the Inglewood or Tamarack areas that cannot achieve this threshold, these requirements for exempting a tightline. However, there may be areas in other parts of the city subject to the landside hazard drainage area that can. For example, there may be a tightline already built and a new addition, for some reason, maybe topography can't get to that tightline. And so the full build-out conditions would be directed to an existing tightline, but this singular house or development couldn't get there. So the geotechnical engineer would have to consider full build-out, but perhaps the full build-out is this singular development. We would like the opportunity to review that with the geotechnical engineer, and that's what these recommendations provide. Flow control and water quality exemptions in critical drainage areas. We recommend that we start allowing exemptions for flow control and water quality facilities in all critical drainage areas. These exemptions have to meet some strict criteria in the Surface Water Design Manual. Right now, there are no exemptions without approval of the Public Works Director. And our experience in the last year has shown that many applications have been submitted for drainage adjustments to the Public Works Director to approve on a site-by-site basis. This takes time, and this takes resources from both builders, developers, and city staff in order to review these case-by-case conditions. The rationale behind our recommendation is that large detention and water quality facilities are pretty difficult to site on individual lots. Often they're a third of the size or more of the lot itself. Excavation may also pose some unintended consequences. The excavation from the photo, spoils would have to be stockpiled somewhere on the site, perhaps on a steep slope. So we want to consider those consequences or unintended consequences. Property owners may not maintain the facilities. They would, because it's a private property, stormwater developed from private property would have to own and maintain these facilities. And oftentimes, property owners do not have the resources or knowledge to maintain them. So many times they will fail. Additional city resources would be needed to inspect these facilities on an individual lot basis, as opposed to, say, the regional facilities that we're proposing in town center or on the subdivisions that we have throughout the city. We would have to inspect them on an individual lot basis once they're constructed. And then finally, mitigation for detention and water quality can be met through low-impact development. So that core requirement, we're not exempting, and we're strictly requiring them to provide low-impact development, to provide water quality, to provide volume control, to reestablish base flows in underlying streams. So here's an example. A lot is located in a critical drainage area, an area that might drain to Beaver Lake. Drainage review would still be required if 500 square feet or more of new impervious is proposed. Under the conditions for exemptions, best management practices and low-impact development must be used, and the house would have to propose less than 5,000 square feet of new or replaced impervious or pollution-generating impervious surface. This is consistent with the exemptions that the rest of the city has for flow control and water quality throughout. The next key proposal is regarding allowable discharges. Hopefully this is an easy one. We have a deadline of February 2nd, 2018 to adopt allowable discharges that the Department of Ecology requires us to do. So we've amended part of the code, 13.30, in order to meet these requirements. And for example, it's allowing things like foundation drains, footing drains, work that the fire department might need to extinguish fires to be allowed as an allowable discharge. And then finally, after careful review of the Inglewood Historic Plat, we recommend repeal of the ordinance, and if the recommended code amendments are adopted as the Planning Commission and staff have proposed, they would apply to critical drainage areas in the Inglewood Historic Plat as well. So our recommendations include amending SMC chapters 1310, 1320, 1330, 21A.15, amending the Sammamish addendum to the 2016 King County Manual, and repeal of the Inglewood Historic Plat stormwater regulations. Our next steps with the City Council include a first reading of the ordinance and a public hearing on November 21st, with a second reading and deliberation and adoption of the ordinance December 5th.
Okay.
So now we've got your
I
questions.
think we're going to light up here. I have Deputy Mayor Malchow, and then Councilmember Gerund, and then Huckabee.
I have a lot of questions and or comments for consideration by the council. So first, I think it's important to point out that in the Inglewood Historic Plat, the underlying zoning is R4, but a lot of the lot sizes are far smaller than what actually R4 is. And when you're talking about the landslide hazard area and the landslide hazard drainage area, that is of consideration when you're talking about impervious surface with the lake being there, as well as downhill neighbors. Tanya, you mentioned when you were talking about exemptions for flow control, that the time the staff was taking on a case-by-case basis was consideration for the exemptions. I'm just not sure that staff time when we're talking about the lake in a landslide hazard area and a critical drainage area is reason enough not to allow for exemptions there. 13.20.040, the recommendation from the Planning Commission was exemptions for core requirements 3 through 8, and then later on in our document it says that the director can then exempt 2 and 9, which leaves us only with core requirement number 1. I find that to be a little concerning. Sorry, I have a ton of notes here. Mary Wichter has mentioned on more than one occasion that we don't have a steep slopes map, and we don't have that layering ability, and it's really hard to get an overall picture as a council member when you're sitting at home behind a computer trying to get layering maps on top of each other. My understanding when I was playing with the layering tool yesterday is that the drainage area actually is underneath the landslide hazard area, correct? They overlap. Mary's in the back going like this.
We have other requirements for landslide hazard areas that don't allow any kind of development, period,
right,
in landslide hazard areas. Yeah, I've heard that that question from Ms. Wichter previously, and I'm not sure I can think of a reason why that would be important, because the restrictions for landslide hazard areas are way far from the landslide hazard drainage areas. There's no development at all in landslide hazard areas. you'd have to go through a reasonable use exception in order to develop anything. That's a public process, that's a critical areas process rather than a critical drainage area.
Okay. So let me go back to some of my other things here. But the exemptions on the flow control, that's what we're saying in all of our paperwork here is essentially when you get boiled down to it, that someone would only be required to do quarter requirement one. That's a possibility because Planning Commission is recommending exemptions 3 through 8, and then the director can give an exemption on 2 and 9.
So we're asking for the code to allow exemptions from 1 and 3 through 8. So 1 is part of the stormwater tightline requirement. So there's an exemption to allow, to not require a stormwater tightline if you have a geotechnical engineer look at cumulative impacts if you are proposing less than 1,000 square feet. So the only core requirements that we would not allow any kind of exemptions for would be 2, which is the offsite analysis. You have to show us where the stormwater is going. And then number 9 is low impact development, flow control BMPs. You have to provide low impact development. And I think it's confusing is the way the Planning Commission recommendation was 3 through 8 is allow exemptions for 3 through 8. And then 1 was divided into the stormwater tightline. So it's kind of broken up by different ways.
Okay, but what you just said about 2 and 9, it says right here, development proposed in critical drainage areas requiring drainage review shall not qualify for any exemptions or exceptions from core requirements 2 or 9 in the surface water design manual unless approved by the director.
Yeah. Yes.
So they can get those exemptions.
Yes. And
Okay.
those were the ones that previously, 1 through 9 didn't allow any kind of exemptions unless approved by the director. And so those were the ones that everybody applied for drainage adjustments for to try to show that they did not need to put in those requirements.
So the other concern I have is LID, if it's used, it doesn't get recorded to title. And so in cases where someone uses an LID technique, they could go back and then subsequently tear out the LID and put in additional impervious surface. We were told if we're not doing code enforcement on this, how are we ever going to know if someone rips out an LID and puts in something that's not low impact?
That's a tough one. I mean, that happens a lot. Or I wouldn't say a lot, but it happens throughout the city in not only critical drainage areas, but anywhere where there's maybe a code violation where somebody has put in a pervious patio, and they want to just make it into a solid patio for some reason. The only course of action we have really is through code compliance. If somebody, say their neighbor says, they did something that they don't think that they should be doing, then we would get our code enforcement officer out there. The tracking on that is extremely difficult throughout the city, and not just in critical drainage areas.
Recorded to title, I guess is,
Well,
can it be recorded to title?
It certainly can. I don't know if
That might help our compliance. If the homeowner knows it's recorded to their title, that they have LID in place, they may be less likely to rip it out.
and actually, they would not probably be able to sell that property should they then subsequently.
They would have to go back
Take
in
it
and
out.
put the LID in order to
Right.
sell their property. And so that's my
Right.
point in recording LID to title, is so that it stays.
Yeah. And, I don't have an issue with that. I think we hear a lot of homeowners say, oh, I didn't read that part. I didn't know. That wasn't clear in the title. We hear that a lot from homeowners.
So my other question is, okay, I walk in with an application for my 999 square feet of impervious surface, and then a year later I come back and I say, I want to add another 500 square feet, and 2 years later the ownership changes and now I want to add a deck. How are we going to look at that property now when they got underneath the 1,000 square foot of impervious surface, but now we're piecemealing in more impervious surface?
Yeah, to me, I don't have any issue with that, because at every single step of that process, they're either going to go through drainage review or they're going to be subject to a tight line if they meet the thresholds.
So if they go over for one parcel, if they're over 1,000, they will now they will have to go through drainage review.
For every permit that they apply for. So if you're right, like if somebody applied for 999 square feet 1 year, and we looked at the cumulative impacts of that with full build-out conditions and said, it looks all right, looks like you can provide that development improvement and you do not have to do a tight line system, we would approve that permit. And again, I think that's a very high bar in order to prove. But we would review that permit, and if Public Works agreed with their geotechnical engineer, we would allow that permit to go forward. And if they came in 2 years later and applied for a new permit, that new permit would have to meet the conditions of the code at that time. It could be an entirely different code at that time. That's what we do in permitting, is we look at the existing code at the time and we decide if it meets the existing code.
Okay, so you talked about cumulative impacts, and I wanted to ask about that because under the tight line exemptions, we talk about the alternative system must consider cumulative impacts on the hazard area under built-out conditions. What do the built-out conditions look like there, especially for the neighbors downhill and the lake quality specifically? Because again, I go back to where I said it's R4 zoning, but it's not R4 there. With the number of lots that are there and the size of those lots, I mean, you're talking about some 5,000 square foot lots. 1,000 square feet of impervious surface is a considerable amount. And when you start talking about that cumulative impact, and I looked at, kind of what's left there, what does that look like in the future at full build out? And what considerations? Is there anything built into the code that, okay, are we checking a box saying, okay, well, we considered it? Or is there some teeth behind considering full build out?
Yeah, I would look at the zoning requirements for that area for a definition of what full build out would look like. So currently we've got building requirements that limit, right now it's there's a minimum yard area that we require in R4, R6 zones. So we would look at that ratio of the impervious surface that we had under that zoning code to determine what that full build out would look like in the area. And it would be the area that would drain to that particular landslide hazard area that we'd be looking at. So they'd have to map out the area that could potentially come to that landslide hazard area and tell us if they had full build out conditions, what would that slope look like? And I will say that it's going to be really difficult to approve something in the Tamarack area or the Inglewood area that would meet this threshold. But I think that there are other areas in the city that, as for example, as I explained, that would be able to meet this threshold.
So one last question, and thank you for answering all my questions. If money were not an issue, and in consideration of what you talked about, balancing property rights with our goals for preserving our lake quality and those in that erosion area and that are downhill from this area, is the real answer to have the city put in, excuse me, tight line's not the word I'm looking for.
Conveyance?
Glenn?
Trunk line, thank you. Is that the real answer? I mean, if we're looking for, water quality, and preservation of that area in consideration of the historic plat and the size of the lots that are there, knowing what could go in there in the future. Is that the real answer? Ideally.
I think that's debatable. I mean, that's probably one answer.
Okay.
Another answer could be property acquisition of all of the properties that are vacant.
Which one's less expensive?
I know. Other possibilities, and we talked about this with the Planning Commission, would be transfer of development rights. Another possibility would be doing some really good low-impact development, maybe a green streets in an area. I don't know if you're familiar with the green or C streets in Seattle, but they've done quite a bit with infiltration. So there's a number of possibilities that the city could investigate, and we are actually looking at neighborhood drainage capital resolution projects that trying to prioritize them and develop projects to do with the budget that the city council has allocated for those, as well as basin planning, obviously, with the Zacus Basin.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Deputy Mayor. No lights went out while you were talking, so while you asked all those questions, there's still a lot more.
I tried.
So next is Councilmember Gerund, and then Huckabee.
Well, she did ask some subsets of my questions, but one in particular in Inglewood, historically, those were recreation lots back in the 1890s or whenever they were platted. So a reasonable use exception would be you're allowed to use it as a recreation lot, it would seem to me. Back when it was under King County, before sewers came in, the county required for a drain field basically 3 lots to build one house and one drain field. So then you put in sanitary sewer, and that's no longer a restriction, and now you can build on individual lots, except that we're bumping up against stormwater issues. So can't we use stormwater issues the same way the county used sanitary sewer issues? That, that a single lot just cannot handle stormwater, such a small lot. So require 2 or 3 lots to be used for a single home. It would seem that you could use that same argument.
Yeah, we haven't considered that, so that's something that perhaps we need to talk to city legal regarding. We talked a lot about reasonable use and takings claims on these legally established lots, but that was not something that we specifically discussed with them, and that's something that we can definitely do.
See, the same thing applied to lots along Lake Sammamish. Before the sanitary sewer came in, those were recreation lots. I know my brother had one, and we never considered that you could build a house on it eventually when the sewer came in. So a reasonable use to that lot was recreation. The other quick question I have is, you have Pine Lake and Beaver Lake as being basically critical areas with the 500-foot restriction. Why don't you have that on Lake Sammamish too? And if you did it for Lake Sammamish, basically most of the water in the plateau drains to Lake Sammamish.
Yeah, we put in Beaver Lake and Pine Lake because we have some phosphorus concerns on those lakes in particular. The water quality treatment standard on those lakes are higher than the ones that we've adopted for Lake Sammamish, because they're small areas and they're very distinct areas that drain to them. Lake Sammamish, most of the city drains to Lake Sammamish. So we did not decide to broaden the critical drainage areas to include Lake Sammamish because it had a lesser standard for water quality treatment, mainly.
So when you're talking about replacement impervious surfaces not counting in the total, I'm confused in 1320-020 drainage review, when required, it says, would require in 2,000 square feet or more of new impervious surface, replaced impervious surface, or new plus replaced impervious surface. So how's that different than what you were saying before?
So that applies to generally the entire city, and then the 500 square foot threshold applies to critical drainage areas.
So in general, you count replacing impervious surface against the total, whereas in the specific 500 area, you don't.
Yeah, but the threshold is 2,000 square feet for citywide. It's a higher threshold. Yes.
Which means if you want to take a gravel driveway, which is impervious, do you consider that impervious?
Yes, the drainage manual does consider that impervious.
And you want to pave it, that if it's more than 2,000 square feet, you've got a problem. Is that it?
It does require a drainage review, yes. And that threshold for 2,000 square feet, new plus replaced, that's something that the city cannot change. That is a requirement of our NPDES permit and our adoption of the 2016 manual. The 500 square foot threshold is something we can change because it applies to critical drainage areas within our city.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Huckabee, and then Hornish.
Okay. I have a question, and then I have a number of comments. I'm looking at the capital projects, the stormwater capital projects, and the first two are the Inglewood Neighborhood Drainage Project for $2.2 million and the Inglewood Neighborhood Water Quality Retrofit for $900,000. Are those the 4 tight lines that were put in north of Inglewood?
I'm not quite sure the 2 capital projects, but there's one capital project, and it's titled the Inglewood Stormwater Retrofit and Non-Motorized Improvement Project.
Well, I'm looking at this from the comp plan, and it talks about Inglewood Neighborhood Drainage and Inglewood Neighborhood Water Quality. And I was looking at a map today, and I see 4 tight lines north of Inglewood. I didn't know if those 2 projects comprise those tight lines or where this is, because Inglewood is fairly large.
Right. So those 4 tight lines up 208th, 210th, 211th Ave, and 211th Place, those all tie into the stormwater tight line that we've put in for on Inglewood Hill Road. Actually, I have a schematic of it, if you
Yeah,
could
I'm
see
just
that.
wondering if this is the project that's still to be done, or if that's the project that's already finished.
I think that was the one that's already done.
Yeah, there was something before I took on the role of stormwater program manager, and they did a little improvement project where they fixed a broken pipe up near 208th Avenue and Northeast 15th, and that could have been part of the.
100,000?
Yeah, that could have been part of it.
I think we'll have to get back to you on that.
Yeah.
You'll have to get back to me on that, because I do see the 4 tight lines north of Inglewood, and I was going to ask you, if we put those in, are we asking people who are developing late to pay latecomer fees when they tie in later?
No, we're not, and that was not discussed with the capital project. That capital project takes stormwater from the road, the public road, and provides a tight line and provides also water quality treatment of the public road. The added benefit would be that these new developments on the north side of Inglewood would be able to tie into them.
But the developer doesn't have to pay a late fee on tie-in. I don't understand why.
I don't believe it was set up that way, but that's, again, something we could look into.
Well,
Okay,
so now that I've got those 2 questions.
At least if not for that one, perhaps for the future
Well, because as I
items.
look at the map, there's another large segment of Inglewood, which is south of Inglewood Road, that, to my knowledge, now, unless this is the proposal for that, there's nothing in the capital project currently. But when I look at this, when I step back and look at it from a higher level perspective, and I was reading the comp plan today, so if you'll bear with me for just a minute. It says there are steep bluffs along the western edge of the Sammamish Plateau. Excessive water flowing down these bluffs can form gullies and ravines where soils are highly erosive, which results in downstream sedimentation and can initiate processes of soil wasting. And it goes on to talk about what that does to the lake, what that does to the fish, and all of the negative impacts. Then I start to look at the maps and look at the maps where we have all of these, what I consider really critical areas. And yes, there are a lot of solutions. We could buy all that property. We could do transfer of development rights. We can't do that currently with the moratorium because that to me would be a really good solution. And I think has been some talk amongst the council about that we might transfer development rights to the town center and take it away from some of those steep slopes in other areas of the city. But that has to be delayed for some time because of the moratorium. But what I'm coming to is looking at, and when you talk about low-impact development, we all went out on a tour and looked at the low-impact development, none of which was successful. I quite agree with Deputy Mayor Malchow that this is the real issue. If you can't get it on the deed, how do we manage it? How do we get the HOA to take care of it? How do you, as staff members, go out and police those things to make sure they're done? So when I look at that, I come to the conclusion that what makes the most sense to me is if we're not going to buy the land, we need to put in some stormwater facilities now before we allow people to continually buy and develop these lots, not only here, not only in the Inglewood area, but in other areas of the community, find out that it's too expensive to develop and then walk away from things. And I think that the negative impact of that, and I understand that's happened quite a bit, where people have bought property, gotten started in the process and said, oh my God, I can't do this. It's going to be too expensive. I had no idea this was going to work. So they just allow the property to be foreclosed upon and walk away from it. To me, if we really want to take care of these steep slopes, it's time for the city to step up and say, we are going to protect these areas because the water is going to flow into the lake. We have a major issue with the lake already with issues. And I just don't see how these other solutions will come about either quickly enough or with a high predictability of success that we really have any other options at this point. And I would like to suggest that perhaps that's something the next council begin to look at, and to look at it from the perspective of how do we get the most success from these projects and over a period of time. I think we all want the Kokanee to do well. We all want the lake to be great. And we've been kind of kicking the can down the road for a long time here. And we definitely talk about Inglewood, but we're looking at other areas of the city too. These codes are going to apply to all the critical areas. So if it were my choice, I would begin looking at how we as a city put these stormwater facilities in place and then charge latecomer fees from when others come on, particularly in the Inglewood area where we already have sewers. And I think we've all known that when you have a sewer, that's where growth goes. And so there's just this natural inclination to shift in that direction. And with the sewers there, I think we're going to constantly get bombarded with people who want to develop because they now have sewer access. And if we do sewers and we do utilities and then we do stormwater, if we have to touch that ground 3 times, we're doing more damage than it would take if we just simply did it one time and put those stormwater facilities in with all the other utilities that are going in. That's my comment.
Thank you. Councilmember Hornish, then Valderrama.
Excuse me, yeah. I appreciate the balancing act that the Planning Commission and staff has done. And I can see that there could be a lot of pluses and minuses. But questions I have. I was confused, and this is just administratively. I couldn't see in the new code where you added language. Was there something I'm missing? Was that colored something differently? Was it underlined? It wasn't underlined. I'm sorry?
should have been colored in red.
See, and we got black and white, so I couldn't see it.
Melanie? Just kidding.
So, yeah, administratively, you might check, because, I mean, I'm looking at this, and this is not a red line.
No, I see what that's crossed out.
It's stricken.
I see what's stricken, yeah, but I can't see what's added. So it was really frustrating to me. It's like, what really changed? How does this all work? So it'd be nice to see it in color, or if you can underline the additions. But I know you underlined some other comments, too, but administrative.
Okay.
I'm a little concerned, and correct me if I'm wrong, the prior exemption was less than 500 feet in Inglewood of new or replaced, correct?
Yes.
So what was the thought process, and why did we increase it to 1,000 by adding these additional conditions? And let me expound on that a little bit more. I'm very concerned about the cumulative effect, but I guess you're kind of taking that into account with one of those conditions. But by going to 1,000 and then with all the lots that still can be developed, the impact, it just feels like it could be so dramatic in an area that we don't want to have any problems with.
And as I've said, that threshold, that high bar that we have to allow an exemption from the Tightline area, it may not be feasible in the Inglewood area, just because of that cumulative effect. But what we came up with was that 500, as it currently exists in the Inglewood Historic Plat, covered areas that were not even in landside hazard drainage areas. There are areas along 212th Avenue from the map that I showed you that aren't even in landside hazard areas. It's just part of the Inglewood Historic Plat. As well, when we spoke with our city legal counsel, requiring a 500 square foot threshold to be met did not give a homeowner an opportunity to build anything. Really, that threshold is going to take up most of a driveway and maybe a living room. If I guess you can have 2 stories or 3 stories. But a 500 square foot threshold to build a small home, we heard from the city legal, and I understand that you'll be speaking with them some more in the upcoming meetings regarding this, is that 500 square foot threshold, it would be difficult to defend a legal takings of a single family residential lot, given that threshold. 1,000 seems, when we ran that by the city legal, they said, well, you could build a small house under that 1,000 square foot threshold. That's a footprint, so you could have several stories. And I think I provided an image in one of my slides that had a view of a house that was right at that 1040. It's an existing house along 208th, and it has a footprint of 1,040 square feet, and it's 3 stories. It has a daylight basement and a garage on the side. So in the perspective of our city legal counsel, 1,000 square foot threshold seemed like it was reasonable for a small house.
But the other thing we're changing is it was 500 new or replaced. If we stayed with 500 new, which is only 1,000 new now, right? Yeah, it's not replaced. Okay, well, we can talk to legal about that. So, okay, I understand. I do want to piggyback on the comment about Lake Sammamish, and one of the things you said that, well, Lake Sammamish is bigger, but it's still of the same ilk of the other 2 lakes. So I don't know why we would say, oh, just because it's bigger, we're going to not worry about it if it's still, and I forget the number, 3D or whatever the designation.
We're already under that designation.
Yeah, but Lake Sammamish is, and so is Pine Lake. So just because it's bigger doesn't mean that it should be less, we should be less worried about it. But if you look at the map, the landside hazard drainage area is pretty much right along Lake Sammamish. So I think it kind of, in effect, precludes or requires these type of things for Lake Sammamish, even though it's not a critical drainage area in definition. That makes sense?
In some of the area.
Most of the way north and south along, I mean, the concern would be if you go to Lake Sammamish, then you'd have to go all the way up on the top of the plateau. So I understand. So, all right, thank you.
Next, Councilmember Valderrama.
Thank you again for putting this together and for the Planning Commission trying to get that balance. I'm curious why the Planning Commission isn't here. Usually when they present the recommendations, we have members of the chair or the deputy chair. to
Larry
present.
was here, I don't know why he left.
Yeah, but he does these cameo appearances at times, but I'm talking about for the chair.
Because you got a memo too.
Yeah. But usually they walk through, so that's always helpful for some of these questions to balance out as an observation. Glad I'm last because it allows most of the questions to be asked. I am very concerned about Lake Sammamish for the reasons that have been cited. I also am concerned about the cumulative impacts that have been cited previously, which I won't elaborate on. I do like Councilmember Jaron's idea about using the stormwater restrictions. I think we should really further explore that as King County had used the septic. When we went back and we put in an ordinance on Inglewood Hill, and particularly it was because of what was taking place on 204th or 207th, one of the ideas was to be able, for the exact point that we have here, is start to restrict some of the developments and the uses that were being done. And this seems to be a good way of doing it, is if we were able to put a mechanism. A question, and then going back, Inglewood Hill Road, we've been told for many years that the number of developable units on Inglewood Hill Road are very limited compared to Thompson Hill Road and other ones. Is that correct?
Are you talking about just the properties adjacent to Inglewood Hill
Or
Road?
housing,
or-
how many plots for new developments to take place on that?
Yeah, I've kind of reviewed, there's a draft vacant lots map that is the Department of Community Development is working on. I've taken a look at that, and it does look like there are quite a bit more vacant lots in the Inglewood Hill area than there are in the Tamarack area, if that was your question, Lewis Thompson.
Okay. And then finally, it goes back to a comment that was mentioned earlier about how we isolate doing this to Inglewood Hill Road or the Inglewood Hill, because again, the Thompsons, the 24s are all critical areas that we're dealing with. And so repealing this here is really in effect setting the precedent for across all of these areas, would it not?
It is, but it's also subject to the new requirements for critical drainage areas. So
Yeah, so-
by repealing it, it's also being subject to the critical drainage areas that we're discussing this evening.
I understand, but we're signaling Inglewood Hill, but really it's addressing all the environmental critical areas in effect, even though they'd be subject to those regulations.
Yes. So basically, what council did is they put special development regulations previously on the Inglewood Hill area, which is, in the map that's included. And then the rest of the city was not subject to this high level of scrutiny. So I think what you're saying is the higher level of scrutiny that is coming back would actually apply citywide related to these particular areas, and not just the Inglewood Hill area that was previously discussed.
Yeah, so this map here is a map of the city, and it shows critical drainage areas. And so the regulations that we're proposing would apply to all of the critical drainage areas shown on this map.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well then, I have just a couple of comments. The questions obviously were very comprehensive that we've received, but a couple of things that were brought up, one by Councilmember Jaron, as Councilmember Valderrama just pointed out, the stormwater restrictions, but also it was interesting, requiring a consolidation of 2 to 3 lots possibly because of the zoning, the size of the zoning that had been made apparent. That's an interesting thing. to look at, I believe. And then Councilmember Huckabee brought up the comprehensive plan and the projects that were in there. It'd be interesting to get the clarification. I think there's going to be follow-up on that.
Right.
And a latecomer fee, if really looking at that plan and a latecomer fee, if not for this, if we haven't done that, that actually is something
opportunity,
that really has merit. So with that, there's no other questions. So unless staff has another comment, we can bring this to conclusion.
Nope, not on this particular item. So also your comment related to having somebody from the Planning Commission, we'll discuss that with them. Perhaps they may want to make a statement prior to the hearing scheduled for the next meeting.
Great. Well, then, before we leave, I just wanted to ask, I think the SCA voting delegate, is that something that, I know that there was an email that went around. I'm wondering, I think Councilmember Jaron suggested that maybe the PIC representative be, if the PIC representative is attending that meeting, then the PIC representative be our delegate. So if everybody would have a head nod for
Head
that,
nod?
great.
Okay, we can't take a vote tonight, but
Right.
we'll do a head nod, so.
Okay. So with that, that's the end of the meeting tonight. Thank you all.